Quick Wednesday morning update on what Donald Trump just said regarding Iran. Donald Trump plans to meet or hold talks with Iran next week. He says we may sign an agreement. I don't know. I don't think it's necessary, but we may sign a document or some form of quick agreement. Now, Donald Trump suggests that maybe we don't need an agreement because the Iranian nuclear program has been, quote unquote, obliterated. This doesn't necessarily align with the best case scenario that I was hoping we would get. I was hoping, and we talked about this yesterday, that regardless of what actually ended up happening at the Fordow enrichment facility, which everybody's talking about right now, right? Donald Trump rejects the Iranian nuclear program recovery report. This is because you've got, on the right, you've got people saying, oh, it's just a really early initial report. Nobody knows. You got Pete Hegseth saying you need a shovel to unbury the Fordow site to see how much damage was caused. You got Democrats saying, oh, Trump's a loser. He didn't really accomplish anything. I don't really think any of that really matters. What matters is that the United States made it clear that we are willing to strike Iran in the defense of Israel, and it sent a really big message to the international community that, hey, the United States isn't going anywhere. Now, personally, I was hoping we would get some form of formalized JCPOA 2.0 with a different name. The reason for that is you could get really clear agreements that maybe Iran won't conduct any enrichment of uranium. Not only can you get limits on uranium enrichment, but you could also find out where those 300 pounds of highly enriched uranium are. We have no idea where those are. The IAEA has lost track of them, and Iran has said, hey, we're going to move these because now we're being attacked by Israel. And the IAEA has lost track of them. So this isn't great because it potentially emboldens Iran to know that, hey, we got our enrichment substantially done. We have our highly enriched product already. Now we could further enrich this and put it into a bomb. Potentially we can do that at a different site or an undamaged site or a site we don't even know about. In my opinion, without some form of a framework or agreement on IAEA inspections and enrichment limits, in addition to opening up potentially some oil exports, which Donald Trump is verbally doing for Iran to export oil to China so that they can collect revenue. So Trump is already doing that. But without a written agreement, it's really hard to measure the guardrails of, hey, what is actually being done? Are we actually following the agreement, or is Trump's memory different from what Iran's memory is? So I think outside of a written agreement, it's a little weird for Trump to suggest, we're just going to have a verbal agreement. To me, this is a little bit of a sign that Trump doesn't actually think he can get an agreement. Remember, there's a difference between a ceasefire and a truce or an agreement. Back in the day, frankly, at this point, a decade ago, when the JCPOA number 1 was signed under the Obama administration, we've previously had ceasefire agreements, but they don't do you much until you have a real framework in place that you can now verify is each side holding up their end of their bargain, basically. To me, this is sort of like doing a real estate deal on a handshake. And then there's an issue in inspections and people get to have disputes or arguments. Oh, I didn't know you were going to do all those inspections or whatever. I don't think it sets up for long-lasting peace to not have a written agreement here. And what we do already know, and we expected this as well, is that the signal that's being sent that the United States is willing to get involved against Iran is probably going to tighten the relationship between Russia and China even more, as well as potentially Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. In fact, a lot of people are concerned that Iran is now motivated specifically to get a bomb because they might believe that if they had a bomb, they wouldn't end up getting attacked. Because think about it, out of the group of 4 I just mentioned, the axis, so to speak, all of them have a nuclear weapon. China has nuclear weapons. They're adding about 100 nuclear weapons per year. Russia has potentially the largest stockpile of nuclear weapons in the world, more so than the United States, though a lot of people argue that maybe only half of Russia's actual stockpile is functional, that they have older warheads. China has only maybe about 300, 400, 500 warheads, whereas the United States and Russia have somewhere between 5,000 to 6,000 nuclear warheads. But China is adding about 100 a year. And North Korea also has nuclear weapons. Israel has nuclear weapons. And so what we find is, Iran might end up being in this position where they say, hey, well, China, Russia, and North Korea aren't getting attacked by the United States. Maybe it's because they have a bomb. Maybe we need to take the enriched uranium we have and get the bomb too. But what's fascinating here is you have this Wall Street Journal piece that the war between Israel and Iran has revived Chinese leaders' interest in a pipeline that would carry Russian natural gas to China. According to people, that's because you're connected by land, right? Then you can avoid having to ship through Arctic regions to other parts of the world, or other forms of shipment that might be land-based trains or otherwise freight. But what you have is these attacks could have potentially, quote, jump-started projects that had been stalled for years. And so we're really tightening our enemies' coordination amongst each other. Mind you, Donald Trump has also said in his press conference that he just gave that he was just sarcastic about ending the war in Ukraine in 24 hours. Of course, anybody who remembers what Donald Trump says knows he wasn't sarcastic. We know that he actually said that if he's elected, the war between Russia and Ukraine might actually end before he's elected, because he's going to start having conversations with them even before he's in office. And worst case, the war would be ended within 24 hours once he was in office. People didn't actually really believe this, so I could see how Donald Trump paints that as sarcasm after the fact. But he makes it clear, like, it's been harder to negotiate with both Zelensky and Putin. And this is, I think, where you're seeing Putin and China sort of entrenched together as this axis that's very resilient against the pressures of the United States. The Power of Serbia 2 pipeline project has been mired in disagreements over pricing and ownership, as well as Chinese concerns about relying too heavily on Russia. But the war in the Middle East has given Beijing reason to reconsider the reliability of oil and natural gas that it gets from the region. Keep in mind, the United States gets about 65% of its oil consumption domestically. China doesn't have that benefit. China relies heavily on the Middle East for oil, very much like what we used to. Back in 2010, we would rely on the international community for 71% of our oil. A lot of that coming from the Middle East, which is why a lot of people say we got involved in, the Persian Gulf War, dealing with Iraq, Kuwait. This is why Operation Iraqi Freedom occurred. It's why we were involved in Afghanistan. It was all because of oil. Fracking industry, which actually blossomed under the Obama administration, and then Trump won, really helped us become sort of self-sufficient, almost, not entirely obviously, but much more self-sufficient than we ever previously had been. So you can see, these Chinese concerns are actually quite reasonable. China imports about 30% of its gas from liquefied natural gas from Qatar and the UAE via the Strait of Hormuz. This is, obviously, there's been a lot of talk about potentially the strait shutting down, this 20-mile choke point, essentially. And I think China realizes that, hey, we're getting so much oil from Iran that if the United States is willing to continue to attack Iran, which we just set the precedent that we are, then maybe China should be more reliant on Russia rather than Iran. Mind you, Russia has also had challenges exporting their oil. They've been exporting their oil at a discount because of sanctions related to the Ukraine war. So China is really picking up cheap energy from Russia. So a pipeline could almost pay for itself. But anyway, more than 90% of Iran's exports now go to China. President Trump made an unusual acknowledgement of China's Iranian oil imports Tuesday after announcing a ceasefire. China can now continue to purchase oil from Iran. Hopefully they will be purchasing plenty from the U.S. as well. However, this is unlikely given that you can probably buy Iranian oil at a discount given the sanctions that limit to whom Iran can really sell oil. White House official later said Trump was simply calling attention to the fact that the ceasefire prevented the disruption of oil flows in the region. But even with the ceasefire in place, the recent conflict has spurred Beijing to cast about for alternatives. Beijing is looking to increase its oil purchases from Russia, which supplies about 1/5 of Chinese oil. And Moscow has been pushing to boost its energy sales to neighbors as it needs cash to fund the Ukrainian war. This makes total sense, by the way. You really have a substantial wartime economy in Russia. And wartime economies typically need outside funding beyond just, war funding, because your GDP is getting crushed from consumption or other investments into your domestic economy. So selling oil is great. Of course, China is a willful buyer because you've got this massive population that needs cheaper energy. That's one of the reasons why carbon emissions are skyrocketing in China. But anyway, Russian state media have linked tensions in the Middle East to the revived Power of Serbia 2 project. LNG Armageddon, China urgently returns to the Power of Serbia 2 project, read one headline on a Russian state news website. Power of Serbia, a sequel to the original Power of Serbia gas link that opened in 2019, has long been more urgent to Moscow than Beijing. Russia lost its biggest energy market when much of its gas exports to Europe stopped after the invasion of Ukraine. Since then, Moscow became increasingly dependent on China. So Moscow will benefit bigly here from this Chinese pipeline. But again, the big thing that we're really doing here is we're pushing these relationships together. As you can see, I mean, this is a great line right here. China is also interested in strengthening its relationship with Russia at a time when the Trump administration is openly discussing driving a wedge between Beijing and Moscow. By the way, this is the same thing that tariff war does, and you can see the rest of this over at the Wall Street Journal, but this is exactly what tariff warfare does. It drives our, potentially our enemies or other allies closer together while minimizing the power of the United States. Something to consider in this sort of involvement that we've now gotten ourselves into in Iran. It's also worth noting that while Donald Trump is not giving up on his maximum power campaign on Iran, he's totally willing to let Iran sell oil to China, and he said that it's possible that in the future we would end up seeing Iran and Israel get back into a conflict. Now, he sort of said this, in my opinion, as hedging rather than a warning. So the quote was, "Conflict between Israel and Iran could start again perhaps soon." Trump did say that, but in the context that he said it, it sounded like he was sort of hedging rather than saying, oh yeah, there's some kind of imminent spillover of hostilities again. He seems very proud of the ceasefire that he's currently negotiated, even referencing how after Iran accidentally sent a rocket, which Iran denied doing, and they don't know who sent the rocket, whatever. Maybe it was a rogue soldier or whatever. But after Iran accidentally, I guess, quote unquote, sent this rocket towards Israel, Israel scrambled about 52 jets to go attack Iran. And Trump was very proud to say that he called on Israel to pull back these jets, and they did, just to sort of maintain peace and the ceasefire. But it shows you the fragility of this deal. And again, outside of having some form of written framework that could be followed up on or vetted or otherwise, it seems to me somewhat weak that Donald Trump doesn't want a written deal. Again, he says he wants to talk with Iran next week and is planning on talking to Iran next week in detail. But going in without a goal for a written agreement just seems like it's something that Iran is essentially going to violate straight away. That said, you know, most media will probably be very focused on these intelligence reports with Fordo. Again, I think it's less important because the signals have been sent around U.S. willingness to get involved. And if Fordo isn't fully destroyed, it's entirely possible we could just go back and finish the job. That's almost not highly unlikely, but it is going to piss Trump off over the next few days, especially as details of the actual report come out. And I think one of the unfortunate things for Donald Trump is that you could end up being in a place where video ends up coming out of the actual sites, potentially undamaged or less damaged than expected, and that could potentially hit Trump's credibility some more. So we'll see what happens. But overall, it seems like this Iran-Israel conflict is really enhancing the coordination between China and Russia. And I don't know that's necessarily a good thing for the United States, but we'll see. So that's the latest on Israel and Iran and what Trump just said.
Why not advertise these things that you told us here? I feel like nobody else knows about this.
We'll try a little advertising and see how it goes.
Congratulations, man. You have done so much. People love you. People look up to you.
Kevin Paffrath there, financial analyst and YouTuber. Meet Kevin. Always great to get your take.